Hey, fellow Gianteers, those of us who like our spirituality with a twist. So we're back we're doing a thing on Jung, and Daniel had this insight idea of talking about more like the kinds of spiritual practices Jung was doing. And that got us to talk about really two things that you can kind of emphasize with Jung. One is this idea of this inner journeying we were talking about, right? And it gave us a chance to talk a couple of different things. If you've been paying attention with these episodes, we've been kind of trying to go through this and give a feeling and a flavor for this. And the other side was this idea of this thing called the transcendent function, which we really haven't had a chance to talk about too much yet. And this will be the time, I think, to do it. And they fit together. So I think on the inner journey thing, you go inside, you find your own inner archetypal world. And then we explored the fact that this leads to kind of like synchronicity, where the archetype will appear internally and externally, which is a great conversation. Fascinating. And then the other part is really this transcendent function. And now I guess back to talking about our old friend, Job, who we've been out of touch with for a little bit. We missed you, Job, and all of your suffering. We will return back to Job because Jung talks about this in answer to Job. So that'll be kind of our idea. All right, what do you think, Daniel? Did you what part of this did you like so far?
It's interesting. We got some feedback from that episode because it's already posted, and somebody said they had a dream and then a reflection of that dream in their life the day before they listened to the episode. So they were like, and then the episode was kind of like an external reminder of them again that this stuff is real. So it was a nice piece of information from somebody who was listening. So it's a reminder for us too. You know what I'm saying?
I've had it with a little bit more with people in my life where there's been a lot of little synchronistic things, and that's kind of cool to see. You talk about synchronicity and then it starts to happen, you realize you're probably on the right track of things, right?
Yeah, I was going to ask, what do you when you have that kind of synchronistic stuff happening in your life, and sometimes it's also a little like nefarious too, where you're like, oh shit, that's ominous, oh God, but like generally speaking, do you feel like that's, I don't want to be binary about it, but how do you feel about it? I'll put it this way.
I mean, I definitely have had the Jungian experience where I feel like that means that there's a particularly deep bond between me and this person. Like that seems like real to me, and I take that pretty seriously. And then sometimes I have the feeling like maybe something that's being said here has more meaning for this other person or something. And you don't want to be the guy going, hey, look I'm pointing out the synchronicity and I'll tell you what I'm saying is so important to you.
Yeah.
You don't want to be that one.
Yeah.
But it did happen even during the week where I was talking with a friend, and I brought up like Nietzsche because my daughter's writing this thesis on Nietzsche. It's been kind of floating around. And he said, I just had a dream last night where I was sitting down with this woman who's a professor of Nietzsche in the dream. And I was like, synchronicity, there you go. Right. And I think Jung's point is like sometimes when you're in a particular mindset, maybe when your emotions are kind of heightened or maybe important things are happening in your life, maybe you get synchronicity even with like other people too. I think that's fair to say, So that was my feeling about that. And I did kind of point it out to the person and I was like, hey, that seems like a synchronistic thing. And I was also like, that seems like maybe an anima thing.
Yeah.
That the figure he was seeing, because we're going to talk about wisdom goddesses today a little bit. Yeah. Seemed like a little wisdom goddessy. Yeah. It's funny with the wisdom goddess thing, I should point out that we're recording on the day of not only the day of the month that is sort of wisdom Buddhist goddess day on the monthly calendar in the sort of tantric Buddhist calendar, but also this is like a wisdom goddess yearly day, or at least wisdom day, Manjushri day kind of.
Yeah.
And we both have a love of Manjushri.
Isn't
so Bodhisattva sort of represents wisdom, right? Yeah.
Is today like Lama Tsongkhapa represent,
Yeah.
Is there a name for that day, like Light Festival or something like that?
Yeah, like they were kind of doing it through Jewel Harvest Festival of Light, but I don't know if I've heard it always described that way.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, but there's like it's a day recognizing him, but the way I always think about it, it's a connection also between him and Manjushri.
Yeah, and maybe
they kind of say he's sort of like an emanation of wisdom or something.
And maybe I know it's a little bit of a side. Maybe you want to just open the door a little bit on Lama Tsongkhapa again, and then we could do Manjushri second, just because we're talking about it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Lama Tsongkhapa is the founder of the school of the Dalai Lamas. And it's a kind of like, he does have stuff that's related back to this Jung stuff. We can probably pull this all together.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that happened with him was that he couldn't make direct contact to Manjushri, which is a funny thing to say in a story about a spiritual figure. Usually you make them all badass and they can do everything, you know, but it sounds more realistic somehow that he couldn't do it. And then he met some monk who was just, I don't know, he wasn't like a great scholar or anything, this other monk, but the monk just could talk to Manjushri. He just had the ability. So he could do the channeling or the journeying to like tap into Manjushri, and Tsongkhapa couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
So Tsongkhapa would ask this other monk, and that monk would talk to Manjushri, and then he would get back the answer, which makes it seem like something like that is more real or something, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they bring it up in like religious studies and things where if the character is doing something that seems like it shows a limitation, that must be more real, you know?
Sure.
People say that like that's the reason you could maybe think historically Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, because why would you say that otherwise?
Right.
It makes Jesus look like a lesser figure or something.
Sure.
So that might be a little bit more of a factual part about that or
I
something.
mean, and that's what
John
John was. That's what John was good at, anyways. It's literally his name, you know.
Yeah, it'd be weird to go. Yeah, if you got the name, you probably have to get into that job.
That's it. I mean, that's all you know.
Yeah, it's pretty weird. John the Baptist, do you baptize people? No, I'm the town florist.
No, I
okay.
I make horseshoes for donkeys, you know.
And you're not John the horseshoer. Okay.
No.
Yeah. And I know you love Manjushri. So you want to like do the Manjushri thing?
Yeah, Manjushri as an emanation of wisdom, you know, pictographically represented usually as like a younger kind of a younger man, probably in his like teenage years. And I think if I'm being correct in this, they reference that in that like most of the time you associate wisdom with age, but that this kind of wisdom maybe is timeless, or you know, some I don't know how would you say that's right? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah,
exactly.
I think there's something to that. Yeah, I think there's something to that.
Yeah, because normally you think of an old wise sage, you know, long beard or long hair if it's female, or you know, like sitting in a cave forever. But like this emanation of or realization of wisdom, it comes at a young point in this person's life.
Or they had the vitality of a young person through the experience of wisdom or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a vitalizing quality to it, something like that.
Yeah. And so as a representation or an emanation of wisdom, one can, you know, connect to this being and glean, you know, be in the practice of wisdom for their, you know, as part of their meditative spiritual kind of practice.
I always like the sword part of it because I maybe have a little bit of thing about swords. I think swords are cool.
And yeah, then we could say, okay, so
a sword, right?
Pictographically, it looks like a younger man in his late teens, holding a book in one hand, and then like for those who are on the video, he has a book in one hand underhanded like this, and then in his other hand is like this flaming sword above his head. And it's the imagery is cool, you know, because like it's
swords are cool.
Yeah, swords are cool, and it's less intimidating than some of the other more wrathful emanations, you know. He doesn't have like, you know, 7 eyeballs and like 100 arms, and you could just see this guy, you know, he's got a sword, he's kind of cool, but it's on fire, and it's cool because like the flames represent like the light of enlightenment, or like, you know, breaking through the darkness, illuminating the darkness, and the sword is representative of like cutting of attachments and things like this, you know. It's
probably like delusions and things too,
sure,
right?
Yeah,
wrong ideas, yeah.
Yeah, and it's just it's a easy, for me anyways, it's an easy thing to visualize, and it was one of the ones that came to me right away as soon as I started doing this kind of Buddhist stuff with Eric. Was it 2015? I think in January of 2015 was when
that probably would have been the time frame. Yeah.
Yep. And that was, you know, sort of like an amazing kind of, I guess I could just tell the story for a minute. You know, I went, like many people in the audience don't have much familiarity, maybe outside of us, some, but if not, you know, because of us, some familiarity with like Tantra or, you know, Tibetan Buddhism to some extent that we talk about it. I mean, I read some books, Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, Tibetan Book of the Dead, you know, and I knew who the Dalai Lama was. I get it, right? Buddha is a guy, big belly, you know, meditations, whatever. But I had a meditation practice and whatever. And Eric, you know, we would talk and he would say, oh yeah, you know, you see like a Manjushri kind of a guy, you know, that just, you know, you see like that kind of, and so, okay. So he's like, after a couple of years, he's like, why don't you come with me to this place in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Jewel Heart. And they have a couple centers, I think in New York and maybe somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, a bunch of them actually, and there's ones in Europe too. I mean, there's a big one in Holland. So
Okay.
I might be selling it short. I don't know if I know where all the centers are. Maybe I should know. I don't know.
Well, there's one here in Chicago too, but
It's,
the one in Ann Arbor had,
that's kind of like that's the mothership kind
yeah,
of.
that's kind of the
But the
mothership.
one in Holland is kind of a hopper too, but I've never been out there to be
Okay.
honest. So,
Yeah,
mhm.
I
Yeah,
didn't even know it existed. So
yeah.
Eric wanted me to meet his teacher who he had been working with for the last, I don't know, 15, 18 years. I don't know how long you were working with.
I feel like Rinpoche a little bit less than that, but
Okay.
like it had a big impact on me. And I mean, it's interesting how you make these choices. It seemed at the time, and again, you'll have your own take on it. It seemed to me like you had part of your practices were set up, but then there was another little space for something else that seemed like it could fit nicely.
Yeah.
And you were like, okay, I'm looking for some other thing to fit.
Yep.
And it was like, okay, well, maybe try this and see what you think.
And so
You
I
know,
went.
and it was that little gap in there, right? Because you had a lot of your shamanistic things were already set up
Yeah.
for yourself, and
Oh,
those were
yeah.
cruising along.
Yeah.
But sometimes you have that feeling like, oh, there's some other piece that could fit into this other place,
Yeah.
you know,
And
something like, I guess, enlightenment tradition kind of stuff, right?
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. And so we went. So there was a weekend initiation or empowerment that was being offered, and I went with Eric, and it was a long weekend, and in the middle of, and now for people again who, if you've never done this before, these empowerments they're rituals. They're days, they're hours slash day long ritual. None of it is in English really. And they're doing these things. They're blessing this water, this wine, this stuff. They're coming around. They're giving you this. You're doing that. You're saying things. You're putting stuff over your eyes. It's a ritual. It's an unbroken tradition for I don't know, 1,000 years,
Thousands, probably.
maybe
Yeah.
right. It's a long. So you do this thing, and you try your best to be engaged with it, but when you have no frame of once you've done it once, then you understand. You're like, oh, I see where we're at, but you've never done it before. It's new, and it gives you an opportunity to be totally without grasping because you have no idea what's coming. You're just sort of here, like, oh,
Yeah.
what's next? What's next? And in the middle of this thing happening, again, it's hours long. In the middle of it, I don't know if I fell asleep or I was just in a deeply meditative state, probably both. I saw this little golden man holding a book that was in the center of the chest of a much larger man, for all that I could say. And I didn't think anything of it other than this little guy was really like very radiant, made of all gold. And so that was it. I sat there and we just looked at each other for a long period of time. That was it. Then the day was over, and Eric and I went to go get some food and go back to our wherever we were staying. And I said, hey, Eric, I saw this little man inside of this big man. And, I have no idea what it is. And Eric goes, oh, yeah, that's Manjushri. And we did the empowerment for Yamantaka, which is, associated with Manjushri. And he's like, and Manjushri, we did that today. So the fact that you saw that without having any frame of reference, any lead in whatsoever, that's fortuitous, and
that seems, as they say, auspicious.
There you go. And from that point forward, that's that he's in, he's close to me.
Stuff like that will happen in these things too.
Yeah.
And it does fit back into Jung, because you go on a little vision quest and shit will appear, right?
Yeah.
And it's very hard to say, like, is that inside, outside? What is that exactly? You know what I mean? Is it an archetype? Is it like a force from the outside appearing on the like? What is those? There's somewhere in between all of this. It really kind of shakes your idea of what constitutes inside and outside, probably, right? Yeah. All right. So this is yearly Manjushri Day and monthly Wisdom Goddess Day, and we're going to be talking about the wisdom goddesses. So seems auspicious, as they would say, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so you want to talk a little bit about Book of Job, right? All right. So how does this connect? I guess it's going to be like, we'll double back and we'll talk a little bit about this Book of Job thing, and it should cut back to the transcendent function. Fingers crossed. So, all right. So Jung has this thing about talking about the biblical John figure, the John that's associated with the fourth gospel. And so he says it's like no accident. This is getting into Jung world again, right? You have to put on a special pair of like Jungian glasses to get where this dude is going. Because Jung goes shocking and surprising ways, as we've been talking about. So he says, okay, there's this book of this Gospel of John. It's the one that starts off where they're talking about Jesus was the Word who was there the whole time, with God at the beginning and all this. And he says the thing about this whole part is that John is the person associated with that book, but he's also the one who's associated with the book of like Revelation and all the apocalyptic stuff. And he says that's no accident that these two things were correlated together. And then he makes the Jung move. He says basically, to understand why this figure is associated with this very lovey-dovey book, the Fourth Gospel, and also with the book of Revelation, you got to understand something about Christian ethics. So we're going to get back to like a Jungian take on the world and the Jungian take on, I guess, the society again. So this is where this is going to go. And he basically says Christian ethics don't work. They don't work at all, especially in the sense that they don't work to produce happiness. Now, he says that that's not their intention. They're not supposed to produce happiness. And the book of Job is kind of about this. So they're not there to make you happy. And Job isn't happy, So it's not a kind of thing that's going to work to make your life successful, happy, or whatever. I guess that goes against the idea of like the prosperity gospel.
Oh
idea,
God, don't get me started on that.
So it's not like, is it Joel Osteen? Is that the guy's name?
Yeah, Joel Olstein, whatever.
Yeah. The whole idea that you do all these things and then God will reward you or something. He says that's not the intention at all, obviously. And in a certain sense, they're just not going to work. And then he continues on in his Jungian way, and he says they're designed to produce these polarities that are essentially impossible and insolvable. So the way Christian ethics works, and again, he says it's not really their fault because they're not supposed to produce happiness. That's not their goal. And he seems to talk a couple of ways about this. Sometimes he seems to say that it gives you the idea of experiencing the full range of the divine, which includes all possibilities or something. So you're going to get pleasant experiences, nasty experiences, and dilemmas that aren't solvable and so on. But then it also seems like it's a lot about maybe the Judeo-Christian God is kind of split inside. And so you feel the polarity inside of this Judeo-Christian God that's been created, and it's kind of internally split up, and therefore you feel this split. But in any case, he says what will happen in a Judean-Christian culture setting is that you'll just get impossible splits that are impossible to reconcile at all. And that's his idea. So it's not supposed to make anybody happy. It's supposed to make you splintered. Now, whether that's a good or a bad thing, maybe it could be the experience of feeling the polarities of life, and maybe that could be good. But he also talks about it with the idea like it's just going to create a bunch of black and white splits that it's going to be very, very hard to solve. And it's probably a reflection of a split culture that has invented a split deity. Let me throw it back to you, Daniel, and see what you think. How are you with him so far?
Yeah, I think that, he's talking about duality, but not coming at it from an Eastern philosophical perspective, which is usually where I think people approach those ideas from, right? He's using a very palatable reference for the culture to accept as something that they're familiar with, right? Because I think if you can introduce an idea that someone could say, oh, I could see your where idea is coming from, but if you give them something that smells more familiar to them, then inherently their experience may lead them to other conclusions that you might be trying to get them to go towards. So that's how this hits me, that he's doing it this way in order to touch that polarity perspective, but not from, again, any East Asian tradition. Because I think some people, just because they don't have any kind of frame of reference for those teachings or where they're coming from or whatever, it seems foreign. Even if the concepts are good or, important, you might brush it off as that's too far away from my comfort zone. You know what I'm saying?
Well, it's weird because like he is a cultural critic. So he's being a cultural critic, but he's doing it in kind of this sly way. Where he's using this opportunity to talk about this book of Job. And he's kind of like, it's a weird book because he kind of moves around and you have to kind of like try to figure out where is he going with this. And ultimately he's being critical, and he's basically saying that there's a very kind of strong kind of Judeo-Christian thing to see things in mutually exclusive polarities and black and white thinking. Now, he actually knows Taoist stuff, yin yang theory. He knows these things. And I think in a way he's saying that he's thinking that those Asian cultures don't have as much of that problem because they don't have this polarity thinking. But his critique is that in Western thinking, it's all good, all bad, all this, all that. So that's what he's trying to get to here.
Yeah.
And it creates these incredible dilemmas. And he's arguing psychologically that there's like there's no way out of them. They're just splintered. And, you know, in a certain sense, it's a question of like, what does it mean? And I think on some level, I think he means it's posywid, which is the purpose of a system is what it does. And he's basically saying, yeah, it polarizes people inside of themselves into things that are like insolvable, because you can never be all good enough to be good enough. And like, it'll be very binary. And so it's interesting. I mean, that's the point he's making when you get down to the end of it. It's like really this idea of like all good, all bad, and it's psychologically damaging. And life is framed in these kind of like insolvable opposites that are very, very hard to reconcile.
Does he have a reason for why? I mean, does he ever get to that kind of conclusion as to why he believes that is the case, or why this is a prevalent thing?
He seems to talk in a couple of ways. He says one way, when he's being more positive, he seems to say something like it gives you the chance to feel the polarity. And then probably ultimately he's going to give this idea of the transcendent function and the idea that you'll learn to transcend. Because he does see this need for the union of these opposites. Otherwise, you're a torn apart person.
Right.
But since the culture is so binary and it's internally divided, and it thinks in this very all or nothing way, then you sort of get fucked up by it, I think he says. So he's trying to point out, for whatever reason this happened, and I don't know if Dana, if he gives a historical reason behind it exactly, but something happened where this culture developed that's like that. And I think in his mind, it created a God that's like this. It's split inside, and that's how it is. Anyways, yeah.
They're of course, they're going to argue with you and say the culture didn't create God, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, that's his point. I was thinking, even now, right? Like, what's a very common statement that people say? It's all good.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And I know it's a euphemism that maybe people have said today, right? Like, oh, don't worry about it. It's all good.
Yeah.
Even in that, like, it's a polar statement, polarized statement. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah.
Right. And I think there's just so many things that probably, I mean, we all do, that we don't even understand the depths of where something comes from, and we use it we borrow it without much mindfulness, really.
Or the idea like it has an implication that you're not seeing the full impact of, or something. For
sure.
Like that,
yeah.
Right.
Like the rule of thumb, something like this,
I thought about it like in astrology, because Jung would know these kinds of things. And we haven't done episodes on astrology per se. It's like in the docket of things to talk about at some point.
Yeah.
We're both have interests in this. But like a lot of times it's framed in these opposites where they're like polarized things, So, you have the astrology wheel in front, and one side has to do with individuality and one side has to do with coupledom, and they're opposites, and they're framed in these oppositional ways. Or it's work and family, opposites, right? Or materiality and spirituality, opposites. So he kind of says there's something that happened in the culture that it's split in this way. And then he thinks that mirrors what happened in the image of the divine, which is all split up inside, So, as we were talking about in previous episodes, his idea of the Judeo-Christian God is it's like internally kind of like polarized inside of itself. And some parts are conscious and unconscious. There's a split. So he's fascinated with this idea that things are like split up inside, probably of the culture, and then also probably of the divinity that it envisions or something, right? I think with the attitude that it'll be like the culture creates its divinity, Whether
Yeah.
there's a divinity or not, that's a different issue, you know. And he makes a big point at the end of the answer to Job that he's not an atheistic person. He's not talking from that framework.
Right.
He's more saying like, okay, for whatever reason, this vision of divinity came out this way, something more like that. So it's like framed in these irreconcilable opposite kind of polarities. And so Jung saw the need that like you can't get polarized into these opposites because they split your personality apart. And that's his idea of the transcendent function. That somehow you have to be able to like approach these what seem like oppositions and transcend them. The example that's given a little bit around this for him was he like was trying to figure out what his career choice should be when he was young. And people say that this was one of his first insights into this or something. Where on the one hand, there was a part of him that was drawn to like philosophy and spirituality and religion and things like that. Came from a religious family. And on the other side, there was a part of him that was kind of more sciencey and, you know, interested in nature and science. And he felt this polarity in himself and he wasn't sure what to do. And in his, the autobiography, the memories, dreams, reflections thing that we've referenced here sometimes when we've been talking about him, he talks about almost like two sides of his personality and he doesn't know what to do with it. There's kind of the more private part of who he is, which is more spiritual part. And then there's the outside part of him, which is sort of more the sciencey part. And he's completely torn up and he doesn't know how to reconcile it at all. And then his idea that he, you know, as a teenager, he starts thinking about this. And I think he kind of even started maybe an early version of his self-reflection and journeying thing even then, you know, going inside himself. And then suddenly there was this insight that he had like, well, I should go and do like a psychiatry. I'll be a doctor and a psychiatrist because that will integrate the two parts of me. And I'll pull this together somehow so they don't stay perpetually splintered. And that's his concern. So somehow you have to get into this transcendent function. I think part of the idea is that when you do the journeying, you'll probably get insights as how to escape these polarities, you know, that people are so torn up by and internally divided inside themselves,
right,
which is a reflection of the outside culture and the outside God. And it's more of a general function of like learning how to either, I guess it's either transcend or unify opposites, something like that. You know, it's one of those two words. I don't know which even is the better one because sometimes it sounds like transcending. Yeah. Sometimes it sounds like unifying. But I think like he played with this, it seems like almost his whole life. And he wrote commentaries on Chinese books of Chinese alchemy, like yin yang kind of stuff. You know, Western alchemy things too, where they're trying to like unite opposites and that whole idea of this. So this seems to be what he's trying to get to in this transcendent function idea. Otherwise, people's lives will be split. And, you know, that's the idea. And I think about him a lot with the way that he was also working with patients. He was a clinician too. So it seems like he saw it in his own life, but I think he saw it in patients' lives, that patients' lives would just get split and like polarized. And they weren't able to bring together these splintered parts. Yeah.
If his assertion, which I find to be a very interesting one, that the culture creates its divinity, or at least its personification of its divinity, and that this divinity is split as the culture is split within itself, then the individual is responsible for his or her own, we'll say, transcendence or unification, or however you want to call it, enlightenment, same thing. How does he, I mean, because I'm not familiar with this, does he also reference the enlightenment of the personification of divinity that the culture has?
Well, we haven't done JC yet. We haven't done Jesus, which becomes kind of like, so that's probably like the next episode. And I want to make sure I present it good.
Okay.
So I want to do him justice with that. But because a general idea, he also sees that the culture is striving for some version of unity. So it's kind of like there's some kind of probably unconscious thing happening where there's a realization like this has to unify somehow. This is too splintered. And maybe even in the way he seems to talk about it, like why is Jesus part divine and part human? Because you're unifying that split, you know?
Got it.
So Jesus becomes kind of a symbol of like where the thing would be going, you know?
Right. Okay.
But he seems to see this splitting, you know, like human divine is a split.
Yeah.
and it's absolute, and then Jesus kind of unifies it or something. Or he has a thing about obviously the split between Sophia and is the feminine side of the divine, and the Yahweh figure is the masculine, and they're split, and the female side is repressed. Well, that's a split, and that split has to be reconciled or something. But I think the idea is that it's like trickling down into all the lives of the individual people involved. And I don't know, I guess if you're listening, you can think about this in your own life. Do you feel split between work and family? Because that's a split.
That's a split.
And the culture has it. And like, if you look at Jung's life, there's a split between like, am I going to be an independent individual person, or am I going to be in relationships? That's a split.
There's also,
and then he has a split of even how he's going to handle it. Am I going to be like just with this one person, or am I going to include another person that I love? Can I love more than one person, or is that a split?
Yeah.
So he's constantly addressing in his life these kind of divisions that the culture has that are very sharp.
There's also a split between people and what they do for like a job / career, and then what they do for themselves. I was having a conversation with one of my patients today, and he's kind of coming into his own practice. He's really, starting to read some Zen books. He's starting to really kind of have some introspections. He said something very insightful today. He said, I'm becoming more aware of myself, my mind's actions and reactions. He goes, but it's almost as if I am now aware that I was always aware of it and never did anything about it. He's like, so there's kind of like a hyper awareness now, as if this was always happening.
The awareness of the awareness or something like that,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. Which they'll say like it's a meta awareness. And we were kind of talking about like how it is that he can tap into that sort of creative side of himself that probably most people don't have time for, or let's put it this way, don't make time for. Everybody has time for it. You have to make time for it. And I think for me, this is one of the big splits, which, eventually when we, get our book out, will be something that I'm going to take on in the work chapter.
You said you wanted to talk a lot about creativity too, right?
Yeah, for sure. Because to me, though, work and creativity, if you can find a way to marry those things together, makes your life so much more meaningful. Like the minute you can do that, it just drives it. It's the wind in the sail, really truly is. And I know that like for some people, their creativity is different. They learn to be creative via a working process, and that's how they do their thing. Or they're more of a community person, and so they're gonna meet clients and schmooze and make sales, and that's their creativity, overcoming problems. But however you do it, I think you do have to like take a look at it and say, okay, there is a divide within me, and that it's the drive to help my family, pay my bills, whatever that drive is, because we all have that to live. But then also there's some part of me that is like a grown child that wants to play or create or enjoy without the pressure of having to-dos. And if you could find a way to, because we spend the bulk of our time working. So if you could find a way to get those two things to at least even hold hands, let alone be unified, I just feel like it takes a lot of the pressure, a lot of the stress off of people's lives, so I like this kind of conversation, is bringing it to the forefront of people's minds that like there's an internal split, multiple internal splits within them, and this is the one that I find to be, for me, what I see.
Bring up like the Jung playfulness thing, because I think part of what he started doing at some point was like building like little like castles out of like rocks, and he started playing, and he was like, and he talks about it, he said it was a little bit embarrassing because he was like, doing these very childlike activities.
He's like in a sandbox in his backyard or something like that.
I mean, something like that. I mean, the equivalent of that. And I'm forgetting the details because I did all this research for this stuff, but he was doing a lot of that kind of stuff. And he was like, well, I'm a grown person, I'm treating patients, but I'm also making time to do these little childhood building projects, and he was like, a little embarrassing, but I'm making a little city, or I'm doing whatever, in the sand or with the twigs, and I can't remember all the details of it, but it was play essentially.
He bought a Star Wars Lego kit. Now he's putting it together, the Death Star,
Yeah. Lando Calrissian and like the little figures.
That's right. Yeah.
Harrison Ford, whatever, Han Solo. Yep, all of them. Yeah. So there's something about that. But so his critique then gets to the end of like this polarizing thing. That it's a very polarizing thing, and it's very polarizing in terms of its assessments of good and bad. and assessments of like, this is the light side and this is the dark side.
Yeah.
And the dark side is bad, Star Wars, I guess. But the dark side really is bad in Star Wars. You can't get away from that, Yeah, you can't say like the emperor has like a good silver lining. No, he's an asshole.
It does seem to be more attractive. They're doing stuff. You know what I mean?
It was the old movie, like something like bad will always triumph over good because good is stupid or something. Or some Mel Brooks movie. They're doing a Star Wars spoof and they use that line in it.
Space balls.
Space balls, I think.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's meh. In any case, so this is his concern. And then he kind of takes little twists in this because he says the trouble with the Gospel of John is it's presenting this image that's like all good. It has to be all good. And it's framed everything in terms of these are the things that are good and these are the things that are bad. And it's very like internally split. And he takes a little funny twist in it because he talks about like celibate orders and, people repressing all these expressions of like passion and sexuality and pleasure. And he says this is basically part of this split too, that somehow the culture got into this place where it decided this is all good and other things are not good, and all that stuff is going to get kind of repressed. So this is his theory. And then he says these repressions, those things, those desires and those feelings don't go away, and instead there's a loss of like the ability to feel as much happiness. It ends up being an unhappy culture, right? And then there's all kinds of repressed feelings, and then this leads to a lot of bitterness. And he's read Nietzsche, and Nietzsche's been kind of hanging around a little bit because my daughter's doing a paper on Nietzsche and like talking about him. But Jung read him, and this is one of Nietzsche's things. He says basically, if you have a belief system that says this is all good and this is all bad, and here's the good things that you have to do, and there's all the bad things, and it's too divisive, it's too split, and it doesn't allow enough space, then you get this bitterness and resentment inside that will start to build up in people, and it's not healthy. But they're doing it to try to be good, but it doesn't produce the good. It's funny, in our own little field of Chinese medicine, Jeffrey Wen will sometimes drop this out. He's a Taoist priest and Chinese medical doctor, and he'll say this about yin yang theory: when you push something too far to one side, it starts to turn to its opposite. And Jung would probably feel something like that too. If you try to push this, let's be good, and you define that good too narrowly, or too restrictively, or too repressively, it starts to go ugly, and people start to get bitter. The weird Chinese medical stuff for this is, he says at one point, and the outcome of this is very easy to see because there's an increase in irritability and anger and bitterness and frustration. And you're like, any Chinese medical person listening to him would go like, oh yeah, that's exactly the wood phase in Chinese medicine. And it produces all these feelings of like anger and frustration when it gets repressed. And the person's really trying hard to be good, but instead it just creates a lot of internal bitterness because the definition of what constitutes the good is too narrow, and it ends up being, again, repressive. It's interesting. I mean, the Chinese medicine leaps out of the book. You're just like, okay, that's Chinese medicine, like right there, if you repress it too much. And then he says that's the reason John gets associated also with the book of Revelation and the Apocalypse. Because psychologically, all of that repression produces this backlash of all this repressed anger and bitterness and resentment. And ultimately, that's the reason why you get, again, the same author kind of like associated with both of these books. Who knows who wrote them?
Right.
But he's saying like it's not an accident that gets tied together, because it shows kind of where all this repression goes. It eventually builds up into this apocalyptic level of like bitterness, And that like maybe the tone throughout the book is like, we've been all good, and then those people who haven't been good, they're fucked. And they're really gonna get it now. We've been the good ones. It's kind of like church lady-ish or something, like the old SNL thing, right? I'm the good person and you're the bad person. And it's not coming from a place of compassion or something. It's coming from a place of like, I've done the good thing and you suck and you deserve to be punished or something. So it leads to this space. And then in this book of Revelation, it's like a fucking bloodbath. And he goes into a lot of description of it. Where the bodies are like kind of like, I haven't read it really. I thought, well, maybe I really should now. And I have Bart Ehrman, who's a scholar on like the New Testament and the Old Testament and all this kind of stuff, biblical scholar, and he wrote a whole book on that. So I thought, well, I better listen to this thing at some point, and I'll share it with the GNT audience if it's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But like Jung is describing, like the bodies are like in a wine press, and it's like crushing them like grapes, and the blood is going everywhere. It's like really graphic, which I never really read the thing. Have you ever read it? I never did.
The Book of Revelations. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had two courses in Bible, two college courses in Bible study.
We read the Revelation. So is it that graphic, like the way he's talking about? Because he's like, it's a bloodbath.
Yeah, but it's been a long time. I don't remember all.
Yeah.
I remember some of, the parts that stuck out to me. I remember, but probably a little bit more of the Old Testament, to be honest. Some of those stories were more fun.
Yeah, the Book of Revelation is like just a bunch of weird symbolism that I imagine would be easy to forget.
Yeah, yeah. But I'll go back and read it. Whenever we do it, I'll go back and read it again. Obviously, why not?
Yeah. So the whole idea is like, there's all of this repressed stuff because the person is forced into this kind of corner of trying to follow this ethics, which really isn't designed to make them happy. It's designed to split them up inside of themselves. And then he says eventually this leads to this Book of Revelation, and then even the figure of Jesus comes back like a slaughterer.
Right.
He's not the lamb anymore. He's this like kind of like, what would you call it? Like a revenge figure that appears from the sky,
what do they call him? The Antichrist or something like this?
Well, he's not the Antichrist in that one. He's he's a destroyer, right? Jesus comes back like, I'm going to judge everybody and kick everybody's ass.
In Judgment Day, yeah.
It's a Judgment Day thing, right?
Yeah.
And you were talking about that, I think. Maybe it was off mic. I can't remember. So if it was, I hope it's okay. I bring it up. But you were saying that a lot of people are attracted to that Jesus. They don't want like a soft, giving Jesus. They want the Jesus who's an ass kicker.
I was gonna bring it up as you were talking, but yeah, there are sections currently of Christianity who do not like the compassionate, sort of soft-voiced Jesus. They think, no offense, if you listen to, if you believe in this and you want to come on the show and talk about it, or you want to have a conversation with me and educate me more deeply, no problem. I read some articles and I find it interesting, so I'm just sharing it. But they view him as kind of a pussy, and that's not the Jesus that they are wanting to engage with. They want the more badass, eye for an eye, which is not a full sentence because it's eye for an eye, leaves the whole world blind. But we're going to just cherry pick like somebody who's on TV once in a while chooses words and, all the best words. But anywho's, they want
that was a subtle reference.
Yeah, subtle. You know what I'm saying? No more references. But they want that version of Jesus, right? That's the one that they want. And, which is kind of like antithetical to literally all of the teachings of Christ, all of them.
Like he's such a curious figure because he can mean so many different things to so many different people, right? So I mean, we can take Jung's take on it in the future, but he's an interesting figure.
Yeah.
People have like tons of different versions who Jesus is for them, right?
Yeah, but we'll do it next time.
We'll do it next time on that one. So okay, so anyway, so this is his point though. His point is that Christian morality doesn't work in the sense of producing happiness. It produces these divisions and these polarities. Maybe that gives the person who's living within them a chance to discover things through experiencing those polarities, if you want to spin it positive. But on the negative side, it tends to drive people into these corners where there's these splits within the culture that then get internalized into themselves. And then in the effort to try to follow it, which is like the idea of how you're going to be a good person, that means inevitably you're going to be repressing a bunch of stuff and feel all torn up inside of yourself. And that creates what we would say in Chinese medicine would be these wood phase problems, these problems with anger, these problems with frustration and repression. And then in the symbolism of the way he's reading it through within the culture, then all of a sudden the next book that emerges is this incredibly wrathful book, right? Which is basically all the repressed anger and frustration like leaping out in this like onslaught of like repressed bitterness or something. That's his take. And even like the figure of Jesus, who's supposed to be the reconciling figure, comes back as like a wrathful figure. He's no longer the lamb, but he's like more like the destroyer or something, right?
Yeah.
So he says that the reason that happens psychologically is because there was just something like in this polarizing of people that led to this thing. So to me, that got to the idea of, what do you do about this?
Right. Right.
And we were talking about this in terms of the meditations, and, and how can you do these practices within your own life? And I don't know, like, I know how this is going to register with you. I'll be curious to see what you think. But the thing that hit me is, like, especially in our little podcast, our goal is not to present like meditative things, like kind of like a Prozac or a Xanax or something.
No.
Not like it's all bad. And we're kind of like, we both struggle with our balance with this. On the one hand, we both have taken like both of these positions too.
Yeah.
One position is kind of like, okay, people need help. And so if this helps, that's good. And also, maybe you have insights as you're going through these things. Maybe your motivation in the beginning is, I need to get my anxiety under control. So let me do something that will help me deal with my anxiety. And as that anxiety gets better, then the insights grow, and we can all say that it's good. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, there's kind of like a way the culture wants to like kind of box everything in, and like kind of like the meditative things, the spiritual things, and like stick them in a nice little box. And they're just like palliatives.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like, again, taking a Prozac or a Xanax or like an ibuprofen or something. You'll feel a little bit better, but maybe you're never getting really to the root of what the problems are. So I know we've talked about this before, but I definitely had this reaction thinking about this stuff with Jung, because you get to the point where he's talking about deep things that are, that at least in part are going to be triggered. The awareness of them are going to be triggered if you start doing the kind of meditations he's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So when you brought up the whole idea of the episode of doing this, I was like, oh, this is an interesting problem. Because on the one hand, sometimes the idea of presenting meditations and things like that are like, okay, this is going to make my life a little bit better.
Right.
It'll make me sleep a little bit better. So it's like a sleep aid. It's an anti-anxiety drug. It's as if there's that. And that's how it's a this or that kind of thing.
Sure.
With this limited kind of medicalized little idea,
life hacking, they call that.
Life hacking or something, right? Yeah. And that's obviously not what Jung is talking about.
Right.
And it occurred to me that if you really start talking about what he's doing there, it's not going to be a life hack.
Right.
It's not that small of a thing, because, one's inner and outer worlds are not separate things. So when you start messing around with your inner world, it's going to like tap into the outer world too. And you're going to start to see different elements of the outer world. And you might feel the need to change them. It's not like you're going to be able to keep everything in your life the same and just all of a sudden you meditate or something.
Right.
That might not be the case. You might start having insights into like, I don't like these parts of my life, or these parts of myself, or the parts of what's going on. And then also, if you're tapping into a lot of spiritual energy, especially someone like Sophia or other wisdom goddesses, they're going to want you to change. They're not going to be like, this is my impression on this. You can tell me what you think, Daniel, but they're not going to be okay with like, okay, I'm just doing my little meditation because it's my own personal Xanax or my own personal Ambien or something. Like a wisdom, if you're going to go deeper, what Jung was doing, that wisdom goddess is not going to be satisfied with that. And I don't know what you think about that, but I just thought that that's an interesting question for me, because a wisdom goddess is going to clamor. It's not going to just be like, okay, that's cool. I'm just going to appear for you just to like help you deal with your little problems, and little sounds pejorative, and I didn't mean it that way, but trying to minimize things, trying to turn them into my little problems. It's going to show you like the big problems. The wisdom goddess is going to come in and it's going to try to shake your world up. And I think Jung had that experience personally. And I think that's what Sophia is going to do, I'm throwing it back to you. What do you think?
Oh, yeah.
So I know it's a stumper. I don't think it's an easy thing.
No. So the previous podcast that was posted, I titled, "Does the Universe Whisper?"
Yeah, I liked it.
And
I like the title.
I think the answer is no. It doesn't whisper. It speaks in sometimes very loud voices.
Yeah.
But like anything, we could find a means to distract us from that sound. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so in one sense, and I don't know why, I'm just thinking in my brain, I was at the grocery store earlier and I bought a kombucha. Once in a while I have a kombucha, as many humans do. He said, "Oh, do you want it out of the bag? Should I leave it out of the bag for you?" And I said, "No." He goes, oh, a lot of people like it out of the bag. And I said, oh, why is that? He said, well, in the world of self-medication, people want to have something, you know, when they leave here. And I was just like, oh, that's an interesting observation. And I was like, no, I don't do that. That's not. I
So
said,
people need it out of the bag and they just start like sipping it down before they get
yeah,
out.
yeah. And I said, well, eventually, anything that could be medicine used too much could be a poison. And I think in this way, this is not, meditation is never going to be a poison, so long that you're open in how you're doing it and not focusing on like weird, evil kind of, kind of evil shit. But if you have a practice of like being open and listening, or being in the flow of whatever it is that you're working on, working with, that those intrinsic spaces of knowingness will open. And at those times, what erupts, whether it be on the meditation cushion or in your life, you become more sensitive to your surroundings, internally and externally. And so there are things that will, just like you said, that will come up, and it will not be a whisper. It won't be a little thing. It's going to say no. And I mean, for me in my life, it just kind of comes. I'm not thinking about like any of these problems. I'm just going along, doing my thing. I don't know why I'm moving my arms right now, but
It's
and
you in motion.
yeah, that's it. And they just kind of like come up almost seemingly out of nowhere and land, boom, like a bird shit right on your windshield. And it's like, okay, what are you going to do about it now? And I feel like the stronger that you become, or I'm not gonna say stronger, let's say more resilient that you become in meditation, during meditation, the more resilient you become in your life. And therefore, unfortunately, you are tasked with having higher difficulty problems sometimes, because you can deal with it, because you have the ability to work through these obstacles in the way that you're doing on a daily basis. And so while some people feel much better doing meditation, and it really does, it's a universal medication in my opinion. It doesn't mean that your life is going to become easier because of it. It doesn't work like that. And for me, like we haven't done an episode on this, and we're going to have to workshop a little bit. Maybe this is what I'll be put together for the beginning of next month. But talking about like the work, something
You're
along
talking
like
about like the professional life, you mean?
no, I mean
Oh, no, the work of spirituality or something like
the
that.
work of spirituality, right? The work of yourself, the work of your life. Like it's work. And you decide to start. I think once you decide to begin meditating, you decide that you're going to start working. Like that's when you decide to start working. And not before that. People are working, of course, but now you're doing it, let's say it voluntarily. You know what I'm saying? Like you're going, okay, fine. I'm going to go in the water and I better learn how to swim because it only gets deeper as time goes on, you know? So that's kind of, I agree with this actually, that like at some points, whether it be the wisdom goddesses or whoever is speaking to you at particular points in your life based on your chart or your karma or your practice, things do come up and they do kind of erupt. It's usually not like a tiny knock on the door. It's a gust and the window opens and a bunch of shit falls over and you're like, oh damn, I better pay attention.
I guess it's like, Jung has the whole thing about until you make the unconscious conscious, it will determine your life, and you will call it fate or something, right?
Yeah.
So, and he makes a big deal about the notion of like, you can go along the process and get kind of dragged along with it, or you can maybe try to get ahead of it a little bit, and the whole idea that, until you go and start doing maybe some of the more stuff you're talking about, the work part of it, then you'll still it'll still go.
Yeah.
The process will still unfold. You'll just be getting your butt kicked from that side of it, right? Because you'll be kind of standing in the way of it. Yeah, that's kind of how he thinks about it. Yeah. But when you brought up this whole idea of this sort of experiential episode, I was like, okay, this is fascinating because we can talk about the journeying, we can talk about the polarity thing and the transcendent function thing.
Yeah.
But I was thinking, okay, if you're going to tap into archetypal figures like Sophia, that's a wisdom goddess, and wisdom goddesses, like, they're different.
They are.
Like they're going to like make a little demand on you. So I thought, well, that's an interesting thing to kind of like talk about or try to share. Right? Because they're not like, oh, you meditated 10 minutes, good for you. And,
right.
That's not like what a wisdom goddess does, because the wisdom goddess wants you to change and evolve.
Yeah.
Right. And it was interesting because I pulled out like kind of the stuff that Jung would be exposed to. There's this Gnostic text called Thunder Perfect Mind.
Mm.
And it's kind of written from the perspective of like a Sophia character, you know, Jung would know this, right? And so what's really interesting about it is like, it does have this quality of like, you got to get over these oppositions. You can't let your life be dominated by a bunch of oppositions that tear you apart inside.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not good, which is what Jung's observation is, probably about himself and his patients, right?
Mm.
So I'll give you a couple lines from it just for the hay of it, right?
Sure, yeah.
So she says, I've issued from a great power and visit all those who contemplate me. So this is the tapping into her part, right? I've been discovered by those who search diligently. Great. Pay attention, those that meditate upon me, and listen well, exclamation point. All of you who are patiently waiting, take me to yourself. Beautiful. Don't dismiss me from your mind, and don't let your inner voices despise me. Interesting. Don't forget me at any time or place. Be watchful. So you're supposed to be like aware of her.
Mm.
And then the book transitions a little bit, and she starts talking about all this opposition stuff, which just kind of gives maybe the vibe of what Jung is talking about too. And he would have known this stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
So she says, I am the first and the last. I am both respected and ignored. I am both the harlot and the holy. I am wife and virgin, mother and daughter, organs of my mother, barren, yet many are my sons. I am she whose marriage is auspicious, but I am husbandless. I am the midwife who doesn't carry the balm of birth pains. I am bride and groom, sired by my spouse. I am mother of my father, sister of my husband, and he's my son. And it continues on like this.
Mm.
And so you're like, well, what's happening here? And you can kind of see what's happening kind of is this explosion of all of these oppositions, you know, and she's like blowing them all apart. And in the end, you won't be able to be left with any of these things, right? She's going to take the oppositional part and she's going to like explode it.
And where's that from, Eric?
Thunder Perfect Mind,
mm-hmm.
one of the Gnostic texts. And that's Sophia. And I just wanted to bring it up because you can see the blowing up of the opposition. She's just like exploding it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about, you know, and it's auspicious we're doing in this on Buddhist Tantric Wisdom Day, but I was thinking about like the Tantric goddesses are like that too. They're fiery figures, you know, the wisdom goddesses. They're not the ones that are like the most, you know, kindly, easily accessible, nurturing. They can have those qualities, but there's a part of them that are kind of a little bit challenging. And they're going to challenge you, especially on what Jung is talking about, these inner divisions, these polarities, these splits between this kind of like black and white thinking. They don't like that stuff. And they're probably going to challenge it. And of course, Jung would know this too. Jung sees the connection between Sophia and Shakti in like Answer to Job. He brings this up. He sees them as being connected. It's not just me saying it from the Jung point of view. But there's sort of a classic story of like the wisdom goddesses and the Buddhist Tantra tradition where they're going to blow these things up. And I was trying to think of one to represent it. And there's one where there's kind of a monk and he's trying to be all keeping his monkliness very pure. And the wisdom goddess Vajrayogini appears as a kind of a beautiful younger woman, and he's there trying to be all good and quote unquote, and in his mind in this polarized way. And she goes walking across the courtyard and she's looking all probably saucy or something, but she's also like dragging like a piece of meat behind her to roast and eat. And it's a classic story. And you know, she's like with the monk, like, hey, you want some of my meat over here? Let's have a barbecue. And of course he thinks that's bad. So he's like, no, I'm not going to do that. And then he realizes that he's fucked up. And it's the wisdom goddess. And she appears saying, you have all these ideas in your mind of what you think are this or that. This is the good thing. This is the bad thing. This is all like a creation of your own mind. Or if you go to Jung, probably a creation of like a culture that's like divided the world in this way. Right. And I'm here to like blow this up. And she continues to do it. I mean, have you heard that story before?
No, never have.
It's a good one. It's a good one. And I can't talk about it too much, but like it'll happen actually.
Yeah.
It's weird to say, but like Sophia will appear or, you know, if you want to say Vajrayogini or Shakti or whatever, she'll appear and she'll like kind of put you on the spot. And she'll point out to you like, hey, this is some spot where you're polarized inside yourself. I'm going to poke on it until you get it, that you're polarizing yourself, right? With these ideas you have in your own mind. And I'm going to thunder it. Do you want to be that way? Thunder perfect mind? I'm going to thunder it, and I'm going to like lightning crack it until you get out of this, you know? So when you brought that, when the idea came up, you brought this great idea up, and I was like, wow, this is not an easy thing to talk about. Because Jung says himself, he's kind of a little afraid of Sophia, right? In his own visions. When he first starts seeing her, he's nervous because he sort of knows that she's going to appear as this figure that's going to be very challenging for him. And when she appears for him, she appears as Salome, who's the biblical figure who was responsible for beheading John the Baptist, you know, in the old story. So, I mean, a lot of people don't know these Bible stories anymore, and you know, you don't have to, obviously. But the story was that she does the dance of the seven veils. So she's sort of an erotic figure, right? And in the end, she pleases the king by this erotic dance. And for her mother, you know, once she gets the king's approval, and the king will offer her a sort of accept one of her requests, right? On behalf of her mother, she demands the head of John the Baptist, and he gets executed. I have a bunch of pictures of this thing from the Louvre when I was in Paris, because they have a lot of like representations of this. It's a kind of an amazing story, and it's very dramatic when you capture it. And so he saw her appearing as that, you know, and then she's with Elijah in his vision, and you know, the prophet, and Elijah says, well, that's my daughter. And like Jung is like confused, obviously, you know, why is this happening? Why am I seeing these two figures, Elijah, a prophet of wisdom, and then this wisdom goddess? But the wisdom goddess is scary for him, you know, and he talks about like being a little afraid of her because he knows, in a certain sense, that she's going to like blow through and not let any of his false concepts stand.
Right.
Like she's not going to do it, you know? And it's kind of interesting. So they're talking, and Elijah explains that he and Salome are one from the beginning. And Jung is like, what? And then he says, well, you are the symbol of the most extreme contradiction. And then Elijah answers, we are not symbols, we are real. And then the whole kind of thing continues on to this idea of things in Jung where he feels all this polarized stuff inside of him. And it's quite interesting then, because when he tries to figure out what Salome and Elijah symbolize for him, he realizes that they're kind of two parts of him. Salome symbolizes sort of the more passionate side of him, the side that wants to love, the side that probably wants to experience pleasure and sexuality and things. And he calls her, she symbolizes love. But when he sees her, she's kind of blinded, like she can't see. And then there's a whole kind of thing that in his interactions with her, she all of a sudden becomes sighted, and he realizes, okay, this was some repressed part of me that I was afraid of. And on the opposite side, Elijah was sort of like insight and rationality and forethinking, but those two parts of him were clashing. So it's another opposition he felt in himself. You know what I mean? The opposition between love and the reasoning part of himself, the passionate part of himself, the love part of himself. So he says this funny thing. I'm going to quote him a little bit here, right? He says, God holds love in his right, forethinking in his left. Love is on the favorable side, forethinking on the unfavorable. This should recommend love to you insofar as you are part of this world, especially if you are a thinker. So he seems to be saying in himself, this got divided up. He split these two parts of himself apart. And then Salome symbolized sort of the one side, and then Elijah kind of the other side. And then he was just splintered inside of himself. So he says, here what happened was previously my desire, my capacity for love was blind. My desiring was blind, but it was love. And I had to like unmask to see what it really was. And so I think the whole idea is that the wisdom goddesses are going to do this kind of stuff. You know, they're going to appear, you know, to challenge us. So again, when you brought the episode, I thought, well, this is really fascinating, you know, And the thing that, like, I mean, maybe it was a closer for me in this, Daniel, because I know you like this one, so I was pulling it back to it in my notes. With the deepest point in these things was that the wisdom goddesses and the archetypes are not your existential guardian operating systems. They're not.
Right.
Like, to go back to your phrase for this, they're not your default mode network. They're not that. They're here to challenge those things. So I don't know if these kinds of practices are the ones that are like the feel-good ones, right? The ones that are kind of like the meditative Xanax or the meditative Prozac or anything. They're really not.
Right.
They're much more challenging.
Yeah.
Right. And they're going to challenge you. And I think we both agree that that's a good thing to do. But they're not the simple ones. And I think the impression I get from Jung in the end, because we spent a lot of time with him over the course of this year looking at different parts of him.
Yeah.
Is that like he came to understand this, I think. And then he also changed his life. Like, eventually realized, like, I'm gonna have to change my life to adjust to these insights that I'm having. So I don't think that's the part that's interesting to me. I don't think the wisdom goddesses and Sophia or Vajrayogini or Shakti or any of these figures are going to leave your life alone. They're not going to do it. They're going to challenge you on it.
That is a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah. I just wanted to be honest about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I wanted to be honest. I know what you think.
Well,
I thought, like, okay, we're going to talk about, that's our GNT thing to talk about it honest. Well, we're talking about it honest.
Yeah. And keeping it, I can't keep it 100, but I can, keep it like 86. Yeah. I hear you,
Yeah.
So, yeah. So for, those who are listening, yeah, it's not going to, it's not going to go away. I mean, and the renouncing of one's practice or practices it will cause the voices to change, but I don't think once you're sort of tapped in that it really disappears. Your life will then go back to being dictated by unconscious forces that you have no longer a relationship with, and things happen to you as opposed to, with you. And I'd rather be in a position of equal opportunity to have influence on the trajectory of my own life and the forces that are happening with it simultaneously as my actions unfold out of a, kind of creative place, but also one with intentionality, where I feel like I get to be my authentic self, but also understanding that I am not the complete driver on the ship, that I'm a co-pilot, if you will, and accepting. I think the acceptance in that comes via the meditative process. There's a quote, and you're kind of saying this, you weren't saying it, but you are kind of saying it, at least in my mind, that is not an easy path to take. This is not, these types of things, they can be anxiety reducing, and they can help with your focus, and they can, all this kind of fun stuff, right? Life hack type things. But simultaneously, it is a building up of one's internal resilience, fortitude, character, however you want to call it. It's kind of a warrior's path. Even if we're doing slow breathing and you're not thinking that you're like some kind of rough and tumble kind of character, it is a warrior's path in some way. And I forgot the book. I think the book is by Dan Millman, and it's called like The Warrior of Light or something like this. And in it, I quote, some quotes stick with you forever. And he said, silence is the warrior's art, and meditation is his sword. And I've always remembered that, because I think when people have the ability to sit in stillness, to embody silence, and to be embodied by silence and stillness together, that gives them a power that very few people have. As I find, at least in my practice and in my life working with people, that people try very, very, very hard to never be in stillness, to not be in silence, to always have something going on in the background, stuff on their schedule. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is a very deep kind of avoidance, in my opinion. And I believe that they're avoiding these spaces where these things come out of naturally. And if people don't want to face them, then they're going to keep themselves floating on the surface like a buoy, as opposed to maybe what we're saying is that, like, yeah, you can go down a little bit deeper, but understand, like, there's currents underneath there that are larger than you, that are happening anyways. So you might as well, at least for me, you might as well consciously approach them, or be whipped around the ocean by whatever the way the wind is blowing, because it's already going to be blowing that way anyways.
Yeah, I think there's like, I think he's saying it. I think he's saying, like, you can either get ahead of this and start, like, trying to become aware of a process and, take a more of a lead on it, or you're just going to get swept up in the process anyways. Yeah. It's going to go on regardless.
Yeah.
There's one other quote I want to throw out with him, and then just maybe it'll be the capper for the episode.
I think so.
My part, but
yeah.
So he's had this quote, and actually I've gotten it like on a t-shirt. But he has this quote that says, like, to be normal is the ideal aim of, like, mediocre people. Which has always sounded like a kind of a harsh thing, but also kind of like darkly funny, because it's kind of statistically true, like normal is like just like the middle. So it's his little poke, right? But I discovered there was like a longer version of it. So it says, to be normal is the ideal aim. Sometimes people say mediocre, sometimes people say unsuccessful. So he says, to be normal is the ideal aim for the unsuccessful, for all those who are still below the general level of adaptation. So he's getting to something kind of deep there. If you're really struggling in life, your goal to be normal is like, okay.
Right, yeah.
That's actually okay. But then he goes on, he says, but for people of more than average ability, people who have never found it difficult to gain successes and accomplish their share of the world's work. So now he's talking about people who are kind of like in the societal zone, they're more like, they're not falling through the bottom, right? He says, for them, the moral compulsion to be nothing but normal signifies the bed of Procrustes, which I guess, I don't know if I'm even pronouncing that Greek right. Procrustes? It's like an old Greek figure. I think he was maybe one of the children of Poseidon or something, but like he's kind of a lunatic. And he has this bed. And the idea is that if you're too small for the bed, he like stretches your bones out and like rips you bigger to fit in the bed. So you're getting tortured that way. Or if you're too tall for the bed, he just cuts off your feet or your legs until you fit in the bed. So he's basically saying, for people who are, otherwise not struggling to get to this place, but they're in it, it's not going to work to stay there, because it's in a certain sense, it's an artificial bed, right? And he's drawing on this old Procrustean image, right? To capture this. And he says, what will start to happen is your life will start to sour. And so he puts it like this. He says, for them, the moral compulsion to be normal, to be nothing but normal, signifies the bed of Procrustes. Hope I'm doing that right. Deadly and insupportable boredom, a hell of sterility and hopelessness. So it's strong, probably too strong on some level, but he's trying to make a point, which is, I think, is more related back to something we've talked about. We've talked about almost like these 4 stages or types of people and where people are at, right? And if you're in the place where you're struggling to hold your life together, to get your life to normal is good, right? It's a much kinder quote than it initially seems. He's saying, yeah, for that person, that's an accomplishment. But if you're in that space where, you're just normal now, what may happen is that may start to sour, right? And it'll start to sour maybe by design almost, right? To force you out of it. It's kind of again, an artificial straitjackety kind of a thing.
Sure.
And then it's from this idea from going from type 2 to type 3, like we talked about in previous episodes. That's when you're trying to break out of this over the confining space. And he's obviously talking about that in himself, and he's talking about that with patients. He eventually saw, like, okay, listen, you're in this spot where this now is too artificially limiting for you, and you're going to feel that tension, right? And you have to like pop out of that now.
Yeah.
And then that will be the goal out. And then that will lead you to like more deeper spiritual fulfillment ultimately. But I think if you're talking about the wisdom goddess, they're going to want you to go above the mundane. They're not going to let you stay in that bed. I mean, even if it's a comfy bed, not, like a whole, you got your sleep number all set up and everything's good. They're not going to let you do it.
You put a
not
quarter
let
in.
You stay asleep.
You put a quarter in there, it vibrates.
Yeah, awesome. You know,
Magic finger.
Magic fingers you. No, they're not going to do it.
No.
No, a wisdom goddess is going to make you go out of the mundane. They're just going to make you do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
So anyways, I think that's it. I mean, it's a good place to
Yeah,
stop, but that's the Tantra. That's the thing, you know, and I think, I mean, from a certain sense, I think, you know, in this whole book of Job thing and all we've been talking about, his visions and the transcendent function, all that, he was, I think, ultimately embodying a certain kind of tantric way of looking at the world. Right? And he's trying to say that this is what's really going to happen. Yeah. All right. So I think we did it justice.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. All right. Cool.
Well, on to
any last closers? Or are you good?
No, we're good. I'm good to go.
Yeah.
We got it. I think we got it wrapped up nice here.
Yeah.
Eric, as always, thank you, my friend, for the journey, for today, for always. To our audience, thank you guys for rocking with us, whether today's number 1 or number whatever number we're on. I don't know. I don't count anymore, but it's in the hundreds for sure. We thank you guys for tuning in. If you want to hit us up, feel free. ginandtantra@gmail.com. That's gin and the word and ginandtantra@gmail.com. You can leave a like or a comment, and the YouTube will definitely see it. Subscribe. It does help us out in the algorithm, which helps us to be seen by more people. And looking at the analytics, more than 90% of the audience actually isn't even our audience. So guys, if you like what we're doing, subscribe. And if you don't like what we're doing, subscribe anyways. Who cares?
Do us a solid.
Give us a solid. You know what I'm saying? Hit us up on Instagram, Gin and Tantra Podcast. We post some things up there. So wherever you do your thing, we're probably there doing ours as well. So share with those whom you like, share with those whom you don't. This is a labor of love, and we definitely love everybody who shows us a little love in return. But if you don't, it's all good.
Love you anyways. It's all good.
For Eric, this is Daniel. We'll catch everybody on the next one. Peace.